Howard Merrick was found dead in his locked office at 11:15 that night, a knife in his back. Time of death was somewhere between 9:45 and 10:15. Even so, 4 separate people described a Howard Merrick who couldn't exist anymore. One said he walked past steady and quick, light vest showing. Another remembered him leaning against the doorframe, loosening a dark tie. A third swore he was laughing loud near the counter, no tie at all. The last insisted he crossed the room with his head down, hands in his pockets. I've handled my share of complicated cases, but this one felt different. By the way, tell me something. What city and country are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Santa Fe, 1938. Everyone described the same night, but no Howard matched the body on the floor. My name is Daniel Carter. After working enough cases, you learn that witnesses don't always lie on purpose. Sometimes memory fails, fear distorts, pressure confuses. But when 4 people describe the same scene and each one sees a different man, that's not a memory problem. That's something else. They called me to Santa Fe in the fall of 1938. Howard Merrick owned a small but respected auction house, specializing in antique furniture and decorative objects. On the night of October 12th, he hosted a special evening auction with about 30 guests. Everything ran smoothly until he stepped into the back office at 9:30, said he had something quick to handle. He never came out alive. When they found the body at 11:15, the office was locked from the inside. Howard had a knife buried in his back and his grey vest soaked through with blood. The window was shut, the key in the internal lock. 2 worried guests broke the door down. The local doctor who examined the body estimated death had occurred between 9:45 and 10:15 that night. Up to that point, it seemed straightforward. The trouble started with the statements. Clara Merrick, the wife, said she saw Howard walking firmly down the hallway after 10, wearing a light vest. Frank Dawson, antique supplier and informal partner, remembered him leaning against the back door, loosening a dark tie. Ruth Navarro, administrative assistant, swore he was laughing loud near the counter at 10:30. No tie at all. George Tillman, frequent collector, insisted he saw Howard cross the room with his head down just before 11, hands in his pockets. All at the same event. All describing a man who, according to the doctor, was already dead. Clara had motive, inheritance and a marriage about to end. Frank did too. Merrick had discovered he'd been selling fake pieces and threatened to turn him in. Ruth had been publicly humiliated when Howard cancelled his promise to make her a junior partner. George owed Merrick money and had been threatened with public exposure if he didn't pay. Any of them could have entered that office. Any of them had reason enough to drive that knife home. But how did they all see Howard Merrick alive after he was already dead? That was the question I needed to answer. I arrived at Howard Merrick's auction house the morning after the crime. The building sat on a side street off Santa Fe's Central Plaza, a low adobe structure with dark wooden beams across the ceiling and small windows that let in little light. The air still smelled of old coffee and the dust that clings to antique furniture. The local police had sealed off the back office, but the main hall was open. It was a long, narrow space with rows of folding chairs still scattered from the night before. Along the sides, shelves displayed decorative objects, vases, picture frames, bronze figurines, carved wooden boxes. At the far end of the hall, a short corridor led to the office where Howard had been found dead. I walked slowly down that corridor. The walls were covered in faded mustard-colored wallpaper, stained with moisture in spots. On the left side, hanging on the wall, there was a large mirror in a tarnished gold frame, its surface clouded with age. On the right, the office door, still showing marks from where it had been forced open around the lock. I stepped into the office. The desk occupied the center of the room, covered with papers, notepads, and 2 empty coffee cups with dried residue at the bottom. The chair lay tipped over on the floor. Dried blood stained the wide plank flooring where the body had fallen. The back window, small with thick glass, was shut from the inside, latch intact. Nothing suggested forced entry. I picked up one of the cups. It had a lipstick mark on the rim, a dark shade, almost wine-colored. The other cup was clean, no marks. I set them both back in place and looked around. Above the desk, a corkboard held receipts, auction dates, supplier contacts. One corner of the board had a small hook with nothing on it. Ruth Navarro had mentioned seeing an extra key hanging there weeks ago. It wasn't there now. The knife had been removed by the police, but I'd seen the report. A thin-bladed letter opener, usually kept in a holder on the side table near the desk. Weapon of opportunity, not something carried in with intent. That detail mattered. Either the killer hadn't planned to kill, or they'd planned it so well they knew exactly what would be within reach. I walked back out into the corridor and stood near the mirror. From that angle, I could see into both the main hall and partway down toward the office door. Anyone standing in the hall could catch a reflection of someone passing through this corridor without looking directly at them. The glass was old enough that it distorted shapes slightly, softened edges. I made a note of it, though I wasn't sure yet what it meant. The building felt quiet in a way that went beyond the absence of people. It was the kind of silence that settles after something violent happens in a place that wasn't built for it. Auction houses are meant for voices, bids called out, the shuffle of feet as buyers circle around objects they want. Not locked doors and knives in the back. I headed back into the main hall and sat down in one of the folding chairs. 30 people had been here the night Howard Merrick died. 30 people moving around, talking, drinking coffee, watching the lots go up for bid. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary activity, someone had walked into that office, driven a knife into Howard's back, locked the door from the inside, and walked out again without anyone noticing. Or maybe someone had noticed. Maybe that's why the stories didn't line up. 4 people saw Howard after he was already dead, or thought they did. Clara saw him in a light vest. Frank saw him loosening a dark tie. Ruth heard him laughing without a tie at all. George watched him cross the room with his head down. All different, all certain. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe 4 people could independently hallucinate the same man in 4 different ways. So either they were lying, or they'd seen something that looked enough like Howard Merrick to fool them in the moment. And if that was true, then the question wasn't just who killed Howard. It was who wanted everyone to think he was still alive an hour after he'd bled out on that office floor. The chairs around me felt too close together. The kind of setup that forces strangers into each other's space. Easy for someone to brush past you in the dark and leave you with only a vague impression. Easy to see someone's back, someone's profile, and fill in the rest from memory. But 4 different patterns, that was harder to explain. I looked toward the corridor again. The lighting in the auction house wasn't strong. A few overhead bulbs in the main hall. A single lamp that had been on the desk in the office. During the event, with 30 people moving around, shadows would have shifted constantly. Someone standing in the corridor half-lit could easily be mistaken for someone else if you only glanced their way. But that still required intention. It required someone knowing how the light fell, where people would be looking, what they'd expect to see. That kind of planning didn't come from panic. It came from someone who'd thought this through. I stood up and walked back toward the office one more time. The corridor felt narrower now, the mirror larger. I stopped in front of it and looked at my own reflection, distorted slightly by the age of the glass. Then I turned and looked at the office door. If someone had stood here dressed in the right clothes, moving in the right way, would people in the hall have assumed it was Howard? Would they have filled in the details their memory expected to see? Maybe. But that still didn't explain how someone got out of a locked room, and it didn't explain why anyone would bother creating the illusion that Howard was still alive when locking the door already bought them time. Unless the illusion wasn't about buying time. Unless it was about confusing the timeline itself. I found Clara Merrick at the small hotel 2 blocks from the auction house, where she'd been staying since the murder. The police had advised her not to leave town, and she'd taken a room on the 2nd floor with a view of the plaza. When I knocked, she opened the door wearing a dark grey dress and no jewelry except a thin wedding band. She invited me in without hesitation. The room was neat, almost sterile. The bed was made, her suitcase closed and pushed against the wall. A single cup of tea sat cooling on the nightstand. She gestured toward the chair by the window and sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. I asked her to walk me through the night of October 12th. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, the kind that comes from someone who's already told the story multiple times and knows which details matter to the police. She'd arrived at the auction house around 8 that evening. Howard had been setting up the last of the display items. They hadn't spoken much. Things between them had been tense for months, she admitted, though she didn't elaborate on why. The auction started at 8:30. Clara stayed near the back of the hall watching the lots go up, but not bidding on anything. She drank coffee, exchanged pleasantries with a few regular customers she recognized. Around 9:30, Howard excused himself and went into the back office. She remembered because someone had asked her where he'd gone, and she'd told them he'd be back shortly. After that, she said, she saw him twice more. Once around 10:15, passing through the corridor near the office. He'd been wearing his grey vest, the one he always wore to formal events. She was sure of it. The second time was closer to 10:45, standing near the shelves on the far side of the hall. He'd looked distracted, like he was searching for something. I asked if she'd spoken to him either time. She shook her head. She'd assumed he was busy, didn't want to interrupt. Looking back, she said she wished she had. I asked about the vest. She paused, then said Howard had been wearing a light brown vest earlier in the evening, not grey. She remembered noticing it when he was setting up, because it was newer, something he'd bought recently. But when she saw him later, it was definitely grey. She didn't know when he'd changed. That detail sat wrong. If Howard was dead by 10:15, he couldn't have changed vests. And if Clara saw someone in a grey vest, it wasn't Howard. Either her memory was playing tricks, or she was lying, or she'd seen someone else. I shifted the conversation to her marriage. She didn't flinch. She said they'd been on the verge of separating for the better part of a year. No affairs, she insisted. Just two people who'd stopped understanding each other. Howard had become consumed by the business, paranoid about suppliers cheating him, obsessed with proving himself in a market that didn't care. She'd tried to help at first, but eventually she'd pulled back. It was easier that way. I asked if she stood to inherit. She said yes, everything. The auction house, their savings, the small property they owned outside of town. She understood how that looked, she added, but she hadn't killed him. She'd been in the main hall the entire night, surrounded by witnesses. Surrounded, yes, but in a crowd of 30 people, all focused on auction lots and side conversations, how closely was anyone really watching her? People remember motion, not stillness. They remember raised voices, not quiet exits. In a room that size, with that many distractions, someone could slip away for 5 minutes and return without anyone marking the absence. I asked if Howard had seemed worried that night, if anyone had threatened him recently. Clara said he'd been on edge for weeks, ever since he'd started questioning the authenticity of some pieces Frank Dawson had been supplying. He hadn't confronted Frank directly yet, but he'd been gathering documentation, building a case. She thought he might have planned to do it that night, after the auction ended. That lined up with what I'd heard from the police. Frank had motive, and a strong one. If Howard exposed him as a fraud, Frank's entire business would collapse. I thanked her for her time and stood to leave. As I reached the door, she asked if I thought the person who killed Howard had been trying to make it look like he was still alive. I told her I didn't know yet. She nodded slowly, then said something that stuck with me. She said Howard had always been good at putting on a performance, making people see what he wanted them to see. Maybe someone had learned that trick from him. I left the hotel and walked back toward the plaza. The afternoon sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows across the adobe buildings. Clara's story felt rehearsed, but that didn't mean it was false. People rehearse the truth when they're afraid it won't sound believable. The problem wasn't whether Clara had motive. She did. The problem was the vest. If Howard had been wearing brown earlier and Clara saw him in grey later, then either she was confused about the timing or someone had deliberately changed into Howard's grey vest to be seen. And if that was true, then whoever killed Howard hadn't just wanted him dead. They'd wanted to control what people remembered about that night. I thought about the mirror in the corridor, the way it caught reflections at odd angles. I thought about the lighting dim enough to soften details. I thought about 30 people moving around a cramped hall, their attention divided. Someone had understood all of that. Someone had known exactly how much you could get away with if you controlled what people expected to see. But who had that kind of nerve? And more importantly, who had access to Howard's grey vest while his body was still cooling in the locked office? I met Frank Dawson in a back room at the police station. He wasn't under arrest, but he'd asked to talk somewhere official, where people could hear every word. Men who insist on that usually want witnesses to their cooperation. Frank was in his early 50s, thick around the middle, greying at the temples. His suit had seen better days, and his patterned tie tried a little too hard to make up for it. When I walked in, he stood and shook my hand a second too long, said he was sorry about the circumstances, then added that he'd heard of my work. I doubted that, but let it pass. I asked him to walk me through the night of the auction. He settled back into the chair, folded his hands on the table, and started talking like a man used to pitching buyers. He'd arrived around 8, dropped off some last-minute pieces in the back room, then stayed visible in the main hall all evening, talking to clients, answering questions, making sure people saw him. At 9:30, Howard went into the back office to handle paperwork. Nothing unusual, Frank said with a small shrug. He stayed in the hall, keeping an eye on things. Around 10, he said he saw Howard near the back door of the main hall, leaning against the frame, loosening a dark tie like the night was finally catching up to him. I asked if they'd spoken. He said no, just exchanged a look. The kind that passes between two men at the end of a long day, he added. I pressed for details. Where exactly had Howard been standing? Which direction was he facing? What was he wearing? Frank was certain. Grey vest, dark tie, shirt cuffs visible at the wrists. When I asked if he'd noticed a watch or a ring, anything like that, he paused and shook his head. Couldn't recall. That was a convenient gap for someone who supposedly made his living reading rooms. I shifted the conversation to their business relationship. At first he called it solid, then downgraded to useful. He supplied pieces on consignment, took a cut when they sold. Simple arrangement, he said. When I mentioned that Howard had been gathering paperwork on some of his recent deliveries, the air in the room changed slightly. Frank's jaw tightened. He asked how much of that was confirmed. I told him I was still looking into it. He denied ever sending fake items. Said talk of forgeries came from jealous competitors who didn't like seeing him do well. I'd heard that excuse before in other cities from other men. It never sounded more convincing with repetition. I brought him back to the timeline. Between 9:30 and 11, he said he never left the main hall except once around 10:30 when he stepped into a side room to help unpack a crate. He was careful to mention that other guests had seen him do it. He listed names and approximate times with a precision that felt a little too polished for someone recalling a casual evening. I asked what Howard had been wearing at the very start of the night, before the auction began. Frank hesitated. He thought it had been a light brown vest, or maybe grey. He wasn't sure. That vagueness didn't match his earlier certainty about the grey vest and dark tie he claimed to have seen near the back door at 10. I brought up the mirror in the corridor. At first he looked puzzled, then nodded slowly, the big one with the gold frame. He said he'd always found it a little strange, like it made you feel watched when you walked down that narrow hall. I asked if he'd ever noticed how much of the main hall you could see reflected in it. He shrugged and said he hadn't really paid attention. A man who works auctions for a living reads faces from across crowded rooms. He watches buyers lean in, hesitate, glance at competitors. I didn't buy that he'd never noticed what a mirror that size could show him. I asked about the letter opener. He knew it right away. Said it sat on the side table in the office, that Howard used it to slice open thick envelopes of paperwork. I asked who else spent enough time in that office to know exactly where the knife was kept. He named Ruth, maybe Clara, maybe himself on business. Then he added something that almost sounded like a throwaway line, that in a small place like that, everybody knew where everything was. It wasn't true, of course, but it said something about how comfortable he felt in that space. He talked about Howard's death with what felt like practiced balance, sad but not too sad, shocked but controlled, called it a tragedy, called Howard difficult but fair, called the killer a coward. None of the words were wrong. They just felt like they'd been tested a few times in his head before he settled on them. When I stood to leave, he stopped me with a question. He wanted to know if I thought the investigation was looking in the right direction. I asked him what he meant. He said that, in his experience, people always start with the money, the spouse, the partner, the one who stands to inherit. He hoped no one was overlooking other possibilities. People who say that are usually imagining their own name on the suspect list. I walked until I found a bench with a view of the street, and sat for a while, letting the pieces settle. Frank hadn't given me anything I could use as proof. No slip of the tongue, no contradiction I could nail him to on paper. But the shape of his story bothered me. Too polished in some places, too vague in others. His memory of Howard near the back door didn't match Clara's sighting in the corridor, or what I'd heard from Ruth about a man laughing near the counter. Each witness seemed to be describing someone at a distance, in motion, half in shadow. No one had touched Howard, No one had spoken to him long enough to confirm details. They'd seen a vest, a tie, a posture. The rest, their minds had filled in. If someone wanted to be seen as Howard, without giving anyone a clear look, that's exactly the kind of memory they'd hoped to create. Quick glimpses, different angles, just enough familiarity to fool people in passing. But I still didn't know how the locked office fit into any of it. I didn't know when the grey vest had left Howard's body, or who had slipped it on. I only knew that Frank Dawson understood crowds, understood what people notice and what they miss, and had more at stake than he was willing to say out loud. That didn't prove he'd killed Howard, but whoever had staged those scattered little sightings around the hall that night needed two things: access to Howard's clothes and the kind of cold nerve it takes to move through a room full of people while building the lie you want them to remember. Frank had both. For now, that was enough to keep his name at the top of my list. Ruth Navarro lived in a small house on the east side of town, close enough to the plaza that she could walk to work, but far enough that the rent stayed affordable. When I knocked, she answered quickly, like she'd been expecting someone. She was younger than I'd imagined, early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and hands that looked used to handling paperwork. She invited me into a tidy front room with a low ceiling and narrow windows. A desk in the corner was stacked with ledgers and auction catalogues. She gestured toward a chair and sat across from me, fingers laced in her lap. I asked her to tell me about the night Howard died. She spoke carefully, like someone who'd already been questioned and knew the weight her words carried. She'd arrived at the auction house around 7:30 to help Howard set up. They'd arranged chairs, positioned display items, brewed coffee for the guests. By 8, everything was ready. The auction began on time. Ruth stayed near the front, keeping track of bids, updating the ledger as lots sold. She said Howard had been in good spirits early on, greeting guests, making small talk. Around 9:30, he told her he needed to step into the office briefly. She'd thought nothing of it. After that, she said she saw him once more. Around 10:30, near the counter where they kept the coffee and spare catalogues. He was laughing, she said, a little louder than usual. She remembered it because Howard rarely laughed like that during events. He was usually more reserved, more focused. But that night he seemed relaxed. She noticed he wasn't wearing a tie, which struck her as odd since he'd been wearing one earlier. I asked if she'd spoken to him. She shook her head. She'd been busy with a buyer who had questions about a sideboard. By the time she looked up again, Howard was gone. I asked what he'd been wearing at the start of the evening. She was certain. Light brown vest, dark tie, white shirt. She'd helped him straighten the tie before the first guests arrived. When I asked what he was wearing when she saw him laughing near the counter, she paused. Grey vest, she thought. No tie, but she couldn't be sure about the vest color. The lighting near the counter wasn't strong. That hesitation mattered. Clara had been certain about the grey vest. Frank had been certain about the dark tie. Ruth wasn't certain about either. Different levels of confidence, different details, same impossible timeline. I shifted to her relationship with Howard. She didn't flinch when I brought it up. She said he'd promised her a junior partnership 6 months ago, then pulled the offer without explanation. She'd been angry at first, then resigned. She stayed because she needed the work and because leaving would have felt like admitting defeat. I asked if she thought Howard had been fair to her. She considered the question, then said he'd been fair in most things, but not in that. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. I asked about the office. How often did she go in there? Daily, she said. She filed paperwork, updated records, pulled contracts when buyers needed them. I asked if she knew where Howard kept the letter opener. She nodded. Side table near the window. She'd used it herself a few times when Howard wasn't around. I asked if anyone else had access to the office. She said Clara did, and Frank stopped by occasionally for business. George Tillman had been in there once or twice to settle payment disputes. The door was usually unlocked during the day, locked at night. I brought up the corridor mirror. She smiled faintly, said it had been there since before she started working at the auction house. Howard liked it, thought it made the narrow hallway feel wider. She said she'd caught her own reflection in it plenty of times, usually when she was carrying something and didn't expect it. It had a way of startling you if you weren't paying attention. I asked if she'd ever noticed how much of the main hall you could see from that mirror. She thought about it, then nodded slowly. You could see part of the room, she said, depending on where you stood. She'd never thought much about it. I asked what she'd done after the body was found. She said she'd stayed in the main hall with the other guests while the police worked. She'd helped Clara sit down when she started shaking. She'd answered questions when the officers asked. Then she'd gone home and hadn't slept much. When I stood to leave, I asked one more question. I asked if Howard had seemed worried about anything in the days before he died. Ruth hesitated, then said he'd been tense. More than usual. He'd been going through old invoices, double-checking supplier records. She thought he was preparing to confront someone, but she hadn't said who. Outside, the sun was lower now, the shadows stretching across the dusty street. I walked slowly, turning Ruth's testimony over in my mind. 3 sightings. Clara in the corridor at 10:15, Frank by the back door around 10, Ruth at the counter at 10:30. None of them matched. None of them could all be true. Unless none of them had seen Howard at all. Someone had moved through that auction hall wearing his clothes, standing where he'd stand, doing just enough to register as familiar without inviting close inspection. Ruth's version included laughter, which felt like a detail someone might add to make the performance convincing. But laughter from a distance, in a crowded room, is just sound. You don't need to see a face clearly to believe you know who's making it. The mirror kept coming back. Ruth had said it startled her sometimes, catching her reflection when she didn't expect it. That meant it showed movement, shapes, the outline of a person without always showing details clearly. If someone knew that, if someone understood how that mirror worked and where people would be looking, they could use it. But I still didn't have the how. I didn't know who'd walked out of that locked office or how they'd managed it. All I had were pieces that didn't fit together yet. I found George Tillman at a boarding house 2 streets north of the plaza. The landlady pointed me to a room on the first floor, narrow and dim, with a single window facing the alley. When I knocked, George opened the door partway, saw who I was, and let me in without a word. He was younger than the others, maybe late 30s, with the kind of lean build that comes from not eating regularly. His shirt was clean but worn, his hands rough from work I couldn't place. He gestured toward the only chair in the room and sat on the edge of the bed. I asked him to walk me through the night of October 12th. He spoke quietly, like someone who'd learned not to draw attention. He'd arrived at the auction around 8:15, later than most. He'd been hoping to bid on a writing desk, something small enough to fit in his room. He stayed near the back, watching the lots go up, waiting for his turn. Around 9:30, he said, Howard stepped into the back office. George remembered because he'd been thinking about asking for a payment extension on a piece he'd bought the month before. But Howard had looked busy, distracted, so George decided to wait. After that, he said, he saw Howard once more. Around 10:45, maybe closer to 11. George had been standing near the shelves on the far side of the hall, and Howard walked past him slowly, head down, hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything, didn't look up. George thought he seemed tired or maybe upset. I asked if he'd spoken to him. George shook his head. He'd wanted to, but something about Howard's posture made him hold back. He said it felt like interrupting someone who didn't want to be bothered. I asked what Howard had been wearing. George frowned, trying to pull the memory back. Dark vest, he thought, maybe grey. No tie that he could see, but he hadn't been looking closely. He'd only noticed Howard from the side in passing. That put George's sighting later than the others. Clara at 10:15, Frank around 10, Ruth at 10:30, George near 11. All of them describing a man who should have been dead for at least half an hour by then. I asked about his relationship with Howard. George didn't hide it. He said he owed money on a piece Howard had sold him 3 months back. He'd been making payments when he could, but he'd fallen behind. Howard had been understanding at first, then less so. The last time they'd spoken, Howard had threatened to take the matter public if George didn't settle up by the end of the month. I asked how much he owed. George said $200. Not a fortune, but enough to ruin him if word got out that he couldn't pay his debts. People stopped doing business with you when they thought you were unreliable. I asked if he'd been angry about the threat. He said yes, but not angry enough to kill anyone. He said Howard had been within his rights to push for payment, even if the timing was bad. George had hoped to work something out that night after the auction ended. But that chance never came. I asked where he'd been between 9:30 and 11. He said he'd stayed in the main hall most of the time, moving around the edges of the room, looking at display items he couldn't afford. Around 10:30, he'd stepped outside for about 20 minutes to clear his head. He'd been feeling boxed in, needed air. When he came back, the auction was still going, and everything seemed normal. That gap bothered me. 20 minutes outside, alone with no one to confirm it. Enough time to slip into the back office, enough time to do what needed doing. But if George had killed Howard, why would he admit to leaving? Most people lie about gaps in their timeline. George had volunteered his. I asked about the office. Had he ever been inside? He said yes a few times, usually to settle payments or sign paperwork. He knew the layout. Desk, side table, corkboard on the wall. He'd seen the letter opener before, noticed it because the handle was bronze and looked old. He said Howard liked things that looked like they had history, even if they were practical. I asked if he knew about the key that used to hang on the corkboard. George looked surprised, then shook his head. He said he'd never paid attention to that kind of detail. I asked what he'd done after the body was found. He said he'd been one of the people standing nearby when Frank and another man broke down the door. He'd seen the blood, the knife, the way Howard's body was slumped over. He'd stepped back and stayed quiet while the police worked. Then he'd left as soon as they said he could. I walked back toward the plaza, thinking about George's story. He had motive, debt, public humiliation, desperation. He had a gap in his timeline that lined up with the window of death, but his manner didn't fit. He'd been too open, too willing to admit the parts that made him look bad. Still, desperation does strange things to people, and 20 minutes outside alone was 20 minutes I couldn't account for. I thought about the sightings again. George's version was the latest, near 11, head down, hands in pockets. If someone had been impersonating Howard throughout the evening, they would have needed to keep it up until just before the body was discovered. George's sighting fit that pattern, but it also felt different. The others had described motion, energy, purpose. George described withdrawal, fatigue, someone who looked like they wanted to disappear. That detail stuck with me. If you're pretending to be someone, you match their energy, their habits. You don't suddenly shift into a different mood unless you're tired, unless you're running out of time, unless the performance is starting to slip, or unless you're not performing at all. Unless you really are tired, really are upset, and someone mistakes you for the man you're pretending to be. I wasn't sure which version I believed yet, but George's 20-minute gap kept pulling at me. Not because it proved anything, because it left room for doubt, and doubt was the one thing I couldn't afford to carry too long. I went back to the auction house late that afternoon. The police had finished their work, but the building was still closed to the public. The officer at the door recognized me and let me through without questions. The main hall felt different in the silence. No voices, no shuffle of feet, no coffee brewing in the back, just empty chairs and the faint smell of dust settling on wood. I walked slowly through the space, trying to see it the way it had been that night. Crowded, dim, full of motion. I stopped in the corridor and stood in front of the mirror. The gold frame was tarnished in places, the glass clouded enough that reflections came through softer than they should. I positioned myself where someone standing in the hall might glance this way and catch movement. From that angle, you saw shape more than detail. A vest, a posture, the outline of a man. Not enough to confirm a face, but enough to assume you knew who it was if you expected to see them. I stepped into the office. The desk had been cleared by the police, but the layout was still the same. The side table near the window still held the empty holder where the letter opener had been kept. The corkboard on the wall still had receipts pinned to it, and the small hook in the corner where Ruth said she'd seen a spare key weeks ago. I walked around the desk, imagining the scene. Howard sitting, leaning forward to reach into a drawer. Someone standing close enough to grab the letter opener from the side table. One quick motion, blade into the back, just below the shoulder blades. No struggle, no time to react. Then the body slumping forward, blood soaking into the vest. The vest. That kept coming back. Howard had been wearing light brown early in the evening. Clara, Ruth, and George had all mentioned it, but the body was found in grey. Frank had been certain he saw Howard in grey around 10. Clara said the same at 10:15. Ruth thought grey at 10:30, though she wasn't sure. Someone had changed Howard's vest after he died. That meant someone had access to both vests, knew where they were kept, and had time to make the switch without being seen. The office door had been locked from the inside when they found the body, but the key was missing from the corkboard. Whoever killed Howard had locked the door from the outside using that spare key, then kept it. I looked at the window again. Still shut, latch secure. No way out except through the door. So how had the killer left the office, locked it from the inside, and still walked away? Unless they hadn't locked it from the inside at all. Unless they'd locked it from the outside and made it look like an inside job. But that only worked if people believed Howard had been alive and moving around after the door was locked. And the only way people would believe that was if they saw him, or someone they thought was him after he was already dead. I walked back out to the corridor and stood near the mirror again. If someone wanted to be mistaken for Howard from a distance, they'd need the right clothes. Grey vest, close enough in build, same general posture. Frank Dawson fit that description. I'd noticed it when I met him. He and Howard were similar in height, both on the heavier side, both greying. In dim light, from across a crowded room or reflected in an old mirror, you might not see the difference. But that still required Frank to have Howard's grey vest, and the only way he'd have it was if he'd taken it off Howard's body after killing him, then put it on himself. I thought about the timeline again. Howard went into the office at 9:30. The doctor estimated death between 9:45 and 10:15. If Frank killed him early in that window, say 9:45, he'd have half an hour to stage everything. Enough time to change vests, lock the door from the outside, pocket the key, then circulate through the hall, being seen at just the right moments. But there was something else. Something I'd noticed during the interviews but hadn't put together yet. When I'd asked Frank about Howard's appearance early in the evening, he'd hesitated. Light brown vest, maybe grey, he'd said. Not sure. That vagueness felt wrong for someone who later claimed to remember exact details about what Howard wore at 10. Unless Frank hadn't been looking at Howard early on. Unless he'd been too busy planning, watching, waiting for the right moment. I walked back into the office one more time and looked at the coffee cups on the desk. 2 of them, both with dried residue. One had a lipstick mark, Clara's most likely. The other was clean. The police report hadn't mentioned a 3rd cup, but that didn't mean one hadn't been there. If the killer had been drinking coffee with Howard and took his own cup when he left, it would explain the meeting, the false sense of routine, the moment Howard let his guard down. If Frank had met Howard in the office around 9:45, under the pretense of discussing business, they might have had coffee together. A short conversation, maybe tense, maybe calm. Then Howard turns to reach for paperwork, and Frank sees his chance. Grabs the letter opener, strikes, it's over in seconds. After that, Frank works quickly. Strips off Howard's light brown vest, puts his own aside, pulls the grey vest onto Howard's body to match what people expect to see later. Then he puts Howard's light brown vest on himself temporarily, leaves the office, locks the door from the outside with the spare key and slips back into the crowd. Later, when enough time has passed, he changes into Howard's grey vest and starts making himself visible in the right places. Near the back door, down the corridor, past the shelves. Always at a distance, always in motion, always where the mirror or the dim lighting would do half the work for him. It fit, almost. But I still didn't have proof. I had theory, pattern, pieces that lined up in a way that made sense. What I didn't have was the one thing that would make it undeniable. I stood in the empty office, staring at the desk, the window, the locked door, trying to see what I was missing. I spent the evening going through my notes at a small cafe near the plaza. The owner brought coffee without asking, left me alone at a corner table with a lamp that flickered every few minutes. Outside, the streets were quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in small towns after dark. I read through the witness statements again, slower this time, looking for what wasn't there instead of what was. Clara had described Howard in the corridor at 10:15, grey vest, moving with purpose, but she hadn't mentioned his hands, his face, anything close enough to confirm identity beyond the clothes. Frank had seen Howard near the back door around 10, loosening a dark tie. He'd been specific about the vest, the shirt cuffs, the posture, but when I'd asked if he noticed anything else, jewelry, a watch, he'd come up empty. For someone who claimed to read buyers from across crowded rooms, that gap felt deliberate. Ruth had heard Howard laughing near the counter at 10:30. She'd noticed the missing tie, thought she saw a grey vest, but she admitted the lighting wasn't good and she'd been distracted by a customer. She hadn't looked closely, hadn't needed to. The mind fills in what it expects. George had seen Howard near 11, head down, hands in pockets. He remembered the dark vest, maybe grey, and the withdrawn posture, but he hadn't seen Howard's face, hadn't heard him speak, just watched him pass in the periphery and assumed. 4 witnesses, 4 sightings. Not one of them had been close enough to see the details that would have mattered. I pulled out the police report and flipped to the medical examiner's notes. Cause of death, puncture wound to the back between the shoulder blades, consistent with thin-bladed instrument. Time of death, estimated between 9:45 p.m. and 10:15 p.m. Then a line I'd skimmed over the first time I read it. Victim identified by distinguishing mark. Small scar on right hand between thumb and index finger, approximately 1 inch in length. I sat back and stared at that line. Howard Merrick had a visible scar on his right hand. Something you'd notice if you were close enough. Something you'd see if he handed you a catalogue, gestured while talking, reached for something on a shelf. I went back through the witness statements. Not one of them had mentioned it. Clara said she saw Howard in the corridor, but she didn't describe his hands. Frank said he saw him loosening a tie, which would have meant his hands were raised, visible, in motion. Ruth said he was laughing near the counter, the kind of relaxed moment where hands move naturally, gesturing, holding a cup. George said Howard had his hands in his pockets, but even then, you'd catch a glimpse when someone walked past you. None of them saw the scar, which meant none of them had seen Howard's hands clearly, which meant none of them had been close enough to see Howard at all. They'd seen someone dressed like Howard, someone who moved through the hall at the right moments in the right clothes, creating just enough presence to be noticed without being examined. And whoever that was had been careful to keep their hands out of sight. I thought about Frank again. During our interview at the police station, he'd been wearing gloves, thin leather gloves, the kind men wear when their hands ache in the cold. He'd said something about arthritis, about the night air. I'd let it pass at the time. Now it felt like more than coincidence. If Frank had put on Howard's grey vest and walked through the auction hall, he would have needed to hide his hands. The scar was too specific, too recognizable. Without it, someone glancing his way might mistake him for Howard. But the moment someone saw his hands clearly, the illusion would break. Gloves solved that problem. They also explained why every witness described seeing Howard at a distance, in motion, never quite close enough to confirm. Frank would have known how far he could push the illusion before it fell apart. He would have stayed just outside that line, letting the crowd's expectations do the rest. I closed my notebook and sat for a while, letting the pieces settle. The vest, the mirror, the lighting, the gloves, the scar no one saw, it all pointed the same direction. But I still needed something concrete, something I could put in front of Frank that he couldn't talk his way around. I thought about the hat. During my first walk through the auction house, I'd noticed Howard's hat hanging in the corridor. Ruth had mentioned it in passing, said it had been missing during the event, then reappeared after the body was found. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it felt like another piece. If Frank had been wearing Howard's vest, he would have needed something to complete the silhouette. A hat would have helped, especially from a distance or in a reflection. It would have hidden his face just enough, added to the impression of someone familiar without inviting scrutiny. And if Frank had taken the hat, worn it during his circuit through the hall, then put it back in place during the confusion after the body was discovered, no one would have thought twice. They'd remember seeing Howard's hat where it always was, and assume it had been there all along. I stood up, left money on the table and walked back out into the night. The air was cooler now, sharp enough to clear my head. I knew what had happened. I knew how Frank had done it. What I didn't know yet was how to prove it in a way that would hold up when I laid it out. But I was close. Closer than Frank probably realized, and tomorrow I'd go back to him with the one question he wouldn't be ready for. I found Frank Dawson the next morning at his supplier warehouse on the edge of town. It was a low building with narrow windows and a loading dock that looked like it hadn't been used in months. When I knocked, he opened the door himself, no surprise on his face this time. He'd been expecting me. He let me in without a word. The interior was dim, rows of shelves stacked with crates and wrapped furniture. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to catch the light slanting through the high windows. Frank walked ahead of me toward a small office in the back corner, gestured for me to sit, then leaned against the edge of a desk. I didn't sit. I stayed standing near the door, keeping the space between us. I asked him about the gloves, the ones he'd been wearing when we spoke at the police station. He looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers like he was testing the joints, then said he wore them most of the time. Arthritis, he repeated. The cold made it worse. I asked if he'd been wearing them the night of the auction. He thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes, he'd had them on. The October nights in Santa Fe got cold once the sun went down. I asked if Howard had ever worn gloves during events. Frank frowned, said no, not that he could remember. Howard didn't like them, thought they made him look too formal. Preferred to keep his hands free when he was moving through the crowd, shaking hands, handling objects. I asked Frank if he'd ever noticed the scar on Howard's right hand, the one between his thumb and index finger. Frank's expression didn't change, but he took a second longer to answer than he should have. He said he'd seen it before, sure. Not something you'd miss if you were doing business with someone for years. I asked if he'd seen it the night of the auction. Specifically when he claimed to have seen Howard near the back door around 10, loosening his tie. Frank said he hadn't been looking at Howard's hands. He'd been looking at his face, his posture. The hands hadn't registered. That was the first crack. A man loosening a tie uses his hands. You see them rise, fingers working the knot, pulling the fabric. You might not focus on them, but you'd notice if something was off. And if you'd spent years doing business with someone, you'd notice if a familiar scar was missing. I shifted to the hat, asked if Howard had been wearing one the night of the auction. Frank hesitated, then said he didn't think so. Howard usually left his hat in the corridor, didn't wear it inside during events. I asked if Frank had seen it hanging there that night. He said he hadn't really looked. It was just part of the background, something you walked past without thinking. I asked when he'd first noticed the hat was missing. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. He said he hadn't noticed it was missing. I told him Ruth had mentioned it, said the hat had been gone during the event, then reappeared sometime after the body was found. Frank said that was news to him. Maybe someone had moved it, borrowed it for some reason. Things got chaotic after the body was discovered. That was the second crack. A man who notices vests, ties, and posture wouldn't miss a hat that appeared and disappeared. Not if he'd been in that corridor multiple times. Not if he'd been paying as much attention as he claimed. I asked about the vest again. Specifically, I asked how certain he was that Howard had been wearing grey when he saw him at 10. Frank said he was certain. Grey vest, no question. I asked what colour vest Howard had been wearing earlier in the evening, before he went into the office. Frank said light brown or maybe tan. He wasn't sure. The lighting at the start of the night hadn't been great. But the lighting at 10 had been worse. The auction hall had fewer lights on by then. Most of the overhead bulbs turned off to save energy once the lots were sold. If Frank couldn't be sure about the vest colour in better light at 8, how could he be certain about grey at 10? He didn't have a good answer for that. He said memory worked strangely sometimes, that some details stuck and others didn't. I let it hang there between us. I asked if he'd gone into the office at any point that night. Frank said no. He'd thought about it, thought about catching Howard for a quick word, but the timing never felt right. Howard had seemed distracted, preoccupied. Frank had decided to wait until after the event. I asked if he'd ever made a copy of the office key, the one that used to hang on the corkboard. Frank's jaw tightened. He said no. Why would he? If he needed to get into the office, Howard would let him in, or Ruth would. There was no reason to make a copy. I told him the key was missing. Had been missing for weeks, according to Ruth. Frank said that wasn't his problem. Maybe Howard had moved it. Maybe someone else had taken it. People lost keys all the time. That was the third crack. A man with nothing to hide doesn't get defensive about a missing key. He shrugs, says it's odd, offers to help figure out where it went. He doesn't call it someone else's problem. I stood there for a moment, watching him. Frank hadn't moved from his spot leaning against the desk, but his posture had shifted. Less relaxed, more guarded. He knew I was circling something, even if he didn't know exactly what. I asked one more question. I asked if he'd been wearing Howard's grey vest at any point during the auction. Frank's expression went flat. He said that was absurd. Why would he wear Howard's vest? I didn't answer. I just watched him. He repeated himself louder this time, said the idea was ridiculous, that I was grasping at nothing, that I didn't have anything real to go on. I told him I'd be in touch and left before he could say anything else. Outside, the air felt cleaner. I walked slowly back toward town, thinking about the cracks I'd opened. They weren't proof, not yet. But they were enough to know I was right. Frank had killed Howard Merrick, worn his vest, used the mirror and the lighting and the crowd's expectations, to create the illusion that Howard was still alive. What I needed now was the one piece that would make it undeniable. I spent the rest of that day walking through Santa Fe, letting my mind work through the details without forcing them. Sometimes the last piece of a case doesn't come from pushing harder. It comes from stepping back and letting the pattern show itself. By late afternoon, I found myself back at the auction house. The officer at the door was different this time, younger, less interested in who I was or why I was there. He waved me through without questions. The building was still empty. The chairs in the main hall were still scattered the same way they'd been the day after the murder. No one had bothered to put them back in order. I walked through the space slowly, retracing the path I'd taken a dozen times already. I stopped in the corridor and looked at the mirror again. The tarnished gold frame, the clouded glass, the way it caught reflections from the main hall at just the right angle. I'd spent so much time thinking about what the mirror had shown people that I'd almost missed what it had hidden. If Frank had been standing here, wearing Howard's vest and hat, the mirror would have shown his back, his silhouette, the outline of someone familiar. But it wouldn't have shown his face clearly. And more importantly, it wouldn't have shown his hands. Not if he'd kept them in his pockets or held them low or turned just enough that the reflection stayed vague. I stepped into the office. The desk was still bare, the floor still stained where Howard's body had fallen. I walked around the room one more time, looking at the side table, the corkboard, the window. Everything I'd already seen, already noted, already turned over in my mind. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. On the floor, partially hidden under the edge of the desk, there was a small stain. Not blood, something darker, thicker, a dark, viscous smudge, like the tarnish and grime from an old metal object. I crouched down and touched it with my finger. The residue had dried, but the mark was still there. I stood up and looked at the corkboard again. The small hook where the spare key used to hang was still empty, but there was a faint discoloration on the cork around it, the kind of mark that comes from something metal sitting in the same spot for a long time, picking up dust and moisture. If Frank had taken that key weeks ago, he would have kept it somewhere safe until he needed it. Not in his pocket where it might clink against coins or get noticed, somewhere deliberate. And when he'd used it the night of the murder, locking the office door from the outside after killing Howard, he would have had to handle it carefully, quickly in the dim light of the corridor. A man wearing gloves might not notice if a key slipped, if it fell for just a second before he caught it. And if it had been sitting on that corkboard for months, gathering dust and tarnish, it might leave a mark when it hit the floor. I looked at the stain again. It was small, easy to miss unless you were looking for it, but it was there. And it lined up with where someone standing at the desk would drop something if their hands were occupied, if they were moving fast, if they were trying not to be heard. It wasn't proof on its own, but it was one more detail that fit. One more piece that said Frank had been in this office, had used that key, had locked the door from the outside, and walked away. I left the office and walked back out to the corridor. I stood where Frank would have stood after locking the door. From here, he would have had a clear view of the main hall through the doorway. He could have seen where people were standing, who was looking his way, who was distracted. And from here, if he'd turned slightly to the left, he would have seen his own reflection in the mirror. Not clearly, never clearly, but enough to know what others would see if they glanced this way, enough to test the illusion before committing to it. I thought about the timeline one more time. Frank kills Howard around 9:45, changes the vests, takes the hat, locks the door from the outside with the spare key. Then he slips back into the crowd, wearing Howard's light brown vest temporarily, keeping a low profile. Sometime between 10 and 10:30, he changes into Howard's grey vest. Maybe in a side room, maybe behind a stack of crates in a dim corner where no one's paying attention. Then he starts the performance. A slow walk past the back door where someone might see him. A pause in the corridor where the mirror catches his reflection. A moment near the counter where Ruth hears laughter that sounds like Howard's. A final pass near the shelves where George sees a man with his head down, hands in his pockets. Each sighting carefully timed, carefully placed. Each one just far enough away, just quick enough that no one gets a clear look. And all of it designed to do one thing: make people believe Howard Merrick was alive and moving through that auction hall long after he was already dead. It was clean. It was smart. And if I hadn't been looking for what the witnesses didn't see instead of what they did, I might have missed it. I walked out of the auction house and stood on the street, watching the last light fade from the sky. I knew what had happened now. I knew how Frank had done it, and why, and what he'd been counting on to make it work. What I didn't know yet was whether he'd slip when I put it all in front of him, whether he'd hold to his story or whether the weight of the details would crack him open. But tomorrow I'd find out. I found Frank at the warehouse again the next morning. This time I brought Sheriff Dalton with me. Frank opened the door and saw us both standing there, and something in his face changed. Not surprise, resignation. We went inside. Dalton stood near the door while I walked Frank through it piece by piece. I started with the motive. Howard had been investigating the provenance of certain pieces Frank had been supplying to the auction house. Items that didn't quite match their documentation, signatures that looked too clean, aging that seemed artificial. Howard hadn't confronted Frank directly yet, but he'd been gathering evidence, asking questions, pulling records. If Howard went public with what he'd found, Frank's reputation would be destroyed. His supplier business would collapse. No auction house, no collector, no reputable dealer would work with him again. So Frank had decided to act first. He'd taken the spare office key from the corkboard weeks earlier, planned the timing, waited for an auction night when the crowd would be large and the conditions right. I told him I knew he'd killed Howard around 9:45, stabbed him in the office while the auction was winding down, and most people were distracted by the final lots or drifting toward the exit. Then came the trick. Frank had swapped vests with Howard's body, taken off his own grey vest and put it on the dead man, taken Howard's light brown vest, the one Howard had been wearing all evening, and worn it himself, at least temporarily. He'd also taken Howard's hat from the corridor hook. The goal was simple: make people believe Howard Merrick was still alive and moving through the auction house after he was already dead. If witnesses placed Howard alive at 10, 10:15, 10:30, it would muddy the timeline, create doubt about when the murder had actually occurred, and give Frank an alibi for the crucial window. I explained the mirror, how Frank had used it to create the most convincing sightings. The tarnished glass and dim corridor lighting made reflections vague, just clear enough to suggest a familiar silhouette, but never sharp enough to reveal details. Frank had stood in that corridor multiple times between 10 and 10:30, wearing Howard's grey vest and hat, back turned to the mirror, and let people catch glimpses as they passed through the main hall. From a distance, in poor light, with expectations doing the work, it looked exactly like Howard Merrick pausing in his own corridor, checking something, adjusting his clothing. The gloves had been critical. They'd hidden Frank's hands, which meant no one saw the missing scar that would have immediately given him away. Howard's scar, between his thumb and index finger on his right hand, was distinctive, something anyone who'd done business with him would recognize. But Frank's hands, covered in black gloves that he wore constantly for his arthritis, showed nothing. The hat had hidden Frank's profile and helped complete the silhouette. And the careful timing, never staying in one spot too long, never letting anyone approach closely, always keeping his back turned or his head down, had done the rest. I told him about the witnesses. Ruth hearing laughter near the counter that sounded like Howard's, George seeing a man in a grey vest by the shelves, head down, hands in pockets, the buyer from Albuquerque seeing someone at the back door around 10, loosening a tie. Each sighting was Frank performing Howard, using the crowd's assumptions and the poor lighting against them. Sometime after the last sighting, probably around 10:45, Frank had slipped into a back room or a dim corner and changed. He'd taken off Howard's grey vest and returned it to the body, putting his own light brown vest back on. He'd hung the hat back on its hook in the corridor. Then he'd waited a reasonable amount of time, discovered the body, played the shocked business partner, and positioned himself as a helpful witness who'd seen Howard alive after 10. The locked door had been the finishing touch. By locking the office from the outside with the stolen key, Frank had created the illusion that Howard had locked himself in, that he'd been alone and safe until someone broke in through the window or picked the lock. It shifted suspicion away from anyone inside the auction house during those critical minutes. But Frank had made mistakes, small ones, the kind that only show up when you stop looking at what witnesses saw and start looking at what they didn't see. The scar they didn't mention, the hat that vanished and reappeared, the vest colors that didn't quite line up with the timeline, and the small dark smudge on the office floor, tarnish and grime from an old metal key that had slipped from gloved hands in the dark. Frank stood there while I talked, arms crossed, eyes on the floor. When I finished, he didn't deny it, he didn't defend himself. He just looked up and asked how I'd figured it out. I told him the truth. The scar, the gloves, the hat that disappeared and reappeared, the vest colors that didn't line up, the mirror that showed everything and nothing at the same time, and the smudge on the office floor where an old key had been dropped just for a second in the dark. Frank nodded slowly. He said Howard had been about to ruin him, that everything Frank had built over 20 years would have been gone the moment Howard made those accusations public. He said he hadn't planned to kill anyone, that he'd just wanted to talk, to negotiate, to buy time. But Howard had refused, had said the evidence was clear, and that he couldn't let fraudulent pieces keep circulating through his auction house. So Frank had acted, and then he'd tried to cover it with mirrors and shadows and misdirection. Dalton stepped forward and cuffed him. Frank didn't resist. He walked toward the door, stopped and looked back at me one more time. Then Dalton led him outside into the cold December morning. I stayed in the warehouse for a moment, looking at the rows of crates and furniture, the dust hanging in the pale light. It had been a smart plan. Careful, deliberate, built on the fact that people see what they expect to see. But expectations cut both ways, and once you started looking for what wasn't there instead of what was, the whole illusion fell apart. I walked out into the December air and closed the door behind me. I left Santa Fe the next morning, early enough that the streets were still empty. The case was closed, Frank was in custody, but it didn't feel like a clean ending. It never does. Arrests are just the beginning of paperwork, court dates, and lives that keep moving forward with new scars. At the bus station, I pulled out my notebook and flipped through the pages, crossed out names, times, arrows, connecting details that most people would never notice. A mirror in a dim hallway, a missing scar on a hand, a dark smudge on an office floor. I thought about Howard and Frank, about how quickly trust could turn into desperation, and how a man could throw away everything on a plan built from shadows and expectations. The bus pulled up, and I closed the notebook. Somewhere out there, another case was already waiting. Another person trying to hide the truth behind carefully arranged lies, hoping no one would look close enough to see the cracks. As long as people kept believing what they expected to see, instead of what was actually there, I'd have work. If this case kept you hooked until the end, leave a like, drop a comment about what surprised you most, and share this video with anyone who loves a good mystery. Subscribe and come back for my next case, where things won't be what they seem.